The bell above Ruth Calder's porch had not rung in 6 years, not because it was broken, because after her husband died she tied the rope out of reach. Then Jonah Vale climbed a ladder, cut it loose and pulled. The bell struck once. Ruth laughed, and at the gate, her grown son stopped his horse so hard the bit rang against its teeth. Jonah looked down from the ladder and understood two things at once. He had brought sound back to that house, and someone was going to make him answer for it. 4 months earlier, Jonah had not been looking for a place to stay. He was hauling a broken wagon axle towards Stevensville when the first hard frost came down from the Bitterroot Range. It silvered the grass, tightened the ground, and turned every breath from his mare into white smoke. The Calder place sat half a mile off the freight road, a low log house, a narrow barn, an orchard gone dark for the season. Nothing about it asked a traveler to stop. What stopped Jonah was the pump. Its handle stood upright beside the well, frozen at an angle no working pump should hold. Beside it, a woman in a brown wool dress leaned her whole weight against the iron and got nothing but a groan from the pipe. Jonah watched for a moment, not because he was deciding whether to help, because a man who understood machinery knew better than to touch it before he understood what had failed. He turned his mare through the gate. The woman heard him, straightened, and reached for the splitting maul beside the well. She did not raise it. She only made sure he saw that she could. "Road is back there," she said. Jonah dismounted slowly. "So is town. I know where town is." Her voice was level, not frightened, not friendly. Jonah looked at the pump, then at the empty bucket near her boots. The leather cup inside the cylinder shrank in the cold, he said. "You can force that handle until spring. It still won't draw." Her eyes narrowed. "You know that from the saddle?" "I know it from breaking enough of them that nearly moved the corner of her mouth." Nearly. Jonah took off his gloves and crouched by the pump housing. The bolts were old, the threads rusted, and one had been hammered out of shape by someone using the wrong wrench. He pulled a small roll of tools from his saddlebag. The woman watched him lay them on the frozen ground. "You carry pump leather with you?" "I carry mistakes I've already paid for." This time she did smile. "Small, quick, gone." Her name was Ruth Calder. He learned that only after the pump began to thump again. The first water came up brown, the second came clear. Ruth filled the bucket and held it against her hip. "You expect money?" "No." "Food?" "No." "A bed?" "No." She studied him the way frontier women studied weather, without trusting the sky, just because it looked harmless. "What do you expect?" Jonah wiped grease from his fingers. "For you not to hit that bolt with a maul again." A breath escaped her. Not quite a laugh, but close enough that Jonah noticed. He packed his tools, nodded once, and rode back toward the freight road. He told himself that was the end of it. 3 days later he returned with a new bolt. Ruth was repairing an orchard fence with baling wire. She looked at the bolt in his hand, then at him. "The pump is working. That bolt isn't. It has held 12 years. It has survived 12 years. That is different." She folded her arms. "You always argue with iron on behalf of people. Only when the iron has a better chance of listening." She stepped aside, not warmly, but she stepped aside. Jonah replaced the bolt. Then he noticed the well cover had split, so he cut a new crosspiece from scrap cedar. Then he saw the gutter above the kitchen sag toward the wall, so he braced that too. He stopped before fixing the loose porch step. A man could help without permission once, twice if he was stubborn. By the third thing he was beginning to tell himself a story. Ruth brought him coffee in a blue enamel cup. It was strong enough to make his eyes water. "You missed the step," she said. "I noticed, and didn't know if you wanted it fixed." She looked down at the board rocking under her boot. "Now you ask. Now I know your name." She took a sip. "That make a difference?" "Yes, Mom." Ruth looked toward the orchard so he would not see the smile arrive. He saw it anyway. After that, Jonah found reasons to pass the Calder place. Some of them were even honest. A hinge from the mercantile, a length of stovepipe, 2 panes of salvaged glass. A sack of salt, he claimed, was cheaper in town, though Ruth had lived in the valley long enough to know exactly what salt cost. He never stayed past sundown. He never entered the house unless she opened the door first. And he never asked a question she had not invited. Ruth noticed all of it. So did the valley. At Mrs. Bell's store, conversations shortened when Jonah bought lamp oil and nails in the same week. At the livery, old men found reasons to mention that Ruth's husband had been dead 6 winters, as if Jonah might have misplaced the calendar. Jonah answered none of them. He had spent half his life around men who mistook noise for authority. Silence was usually cheaper. By late November, the orchard fence stood straight. The gutter carried rain away from the kitchen, and the porch step no longer complained under Ruth's weight. The house had begun to make different sounds. The pump worked in a steady rhythm. The kitchen window closed without rattling. The front gate clicked cleanly into place. Little noises, ordinary noises, but Ruth had lived with broken sounds long enough to hear the difference. One gray afternoon, Jonah found the brass bell above the porch. It was half hidden under a swallow's nest, green with weather, its rope knotted high around the beam. Used to call the men in from the north field, Ruth said behind him. Jonah kept his eyes on the bell. Still could. No men in the north field. The horses would hear it. I have one horse. He looks lonely. Ruth came to stand beside him. The bell's clapper had rusted against the bronze. Jonah could see where someone had stopped caring for it all at once. My husband pulled that rope every evening, she said. Her voice changed on the last word. Not weaker, farther away. Jonah stepped back from the bell. I'll leave it. Ruth looked at him. For weeks she had watched him fix whatever his hands could reach. This was the first thing he chose not to touch. Why? Because not everything quiet is broken. The wind moved through the empty orchard. Ruth lowered her eyes. My son says things like that when he wants to sound wise. Does it work? No. Then I'll stop. She laughed. A real laugh this time. Brief, surprised, almost angry at itself. Jonah did not smile too quickly. He only looked at the bell again and said, If you ever want it down, I'll take it down. Ruth's hand tightened around the coffee cup she carried. I don't want it down, then it stays. That was the afternoon Eli Calder rode through the gate. He was 32, broad through the shoulders, and carried himself like a man who had learned early that his mother's burdens would become his if she ever admitted to having them. His eyes went first to Jonah, then to the repaired porch, then to Ruth's face. He had heard the last trace of her laughter. That was enough to put iron in his jaw. Ma, he said. Ellie. No embrace, no ceremony. They were not a family that performed affection when the work already proved it. Eli dismounted and held Jonah's gaze. Who is he? Standing close enough to answer, Ruth said. Jonah offered his hand, Jonah Vale. Eli looked at it, then took it once. Passing through, that was the plan. Plans change, roads do. Eli released his hand. Behind them, the brass bell tapped once against its frame. A small, dead sound. Eli looked up at it. Then back at Jonah. Leave that one alone. Jonah nodded. I intend to. That evening, Ruth set 3 plates on the table. Eli had not invited Jonah. Ruth had. The distinction mattered. They ate elk stew, potatoes, and bread baked in a black iron oven. Eli asked questions without making them sound like questions. Where Jonah had worked. How long he had freighted. Whether he owned land. Whether anyone expected him somewhere else. Jonah answered plainly. He had repaired wagons for the army after the war. He had driven freight from Fort Benton to the mining camps. He owned a mare, 2 saddlebags, a tool chest, and a rented shed, and no land. No wife waited for him. No child used his name. Eli tore bread with both hands. A man gets to your age with no place. There's usually a reason. Ruth set down her spoon. Ellie. Jonah lifted a hand slightly. It's fair. Then he looked across the table. The reason is I kept leaving before anyone could ask me to stay. The room changed. Ruth's eyes settled on him. Eli leaned back. That honesty, best version I have. No one spoke for several seconds. The stove settled with a dull pop. Then Ruth passed Jonah the bread. After supper, Eli walked him to the hitch rail. Frost had hardened the yard. Every step sounded sharp. You fixing things for her? Eli said. Because they need fixing, yes. And that is all? Jonah looked toward the dark kitchen window. Ruth's shadow moved behind the curtain. No. Eli's face did not change, but something in him braced. Jonah went on before he could be accused of hiding. I didn't ride in looking for it. No man ever does after he finds it. Jonah tied his bedroll behind the saddle. Eli stood between him and the gate, not threatening him, just making the road feel narrower. My father built that house, he said. My mother kept it standing after he died. She did not ask another man to come turn kindness into a claim. I know. Do you? Yes. Eli looked at Jonah's hands. Split knuckles, grease under the nails. The hands of a man who left repairs behind him and kept no proof. Then he said quietly, a man can wake a house up. He'd better understand what happens if he leaves. Jonah felt the sentence land where warnings were supposed to land. Deep enough to change behavior, he mounted without argument. I understand, but he did not yet. For the next 9 days, Jonah did not return. He worked at the stage station, replacing a cracked wheel hub. He slept in the loft above the livery. He ate from a tin plate and told himself distance was the cleanest form of respect. Each morning he looked toward the south road. Each evening he did not take it. At the Calder place, Ruth kept working. She hauled water, fed the mare, patched a tear in the barn roof. She did not stand at the gate. She did not ask the storekeeper whether Jonah had been in town. But on the 10th day, she climbed onto the porch rail and reteed the bell rope high around the beam. Eli saw her do it. He was repairing a harness buckle at the table. "Ma," she kept pulling the knot tight. "He leave because of you?" Eli stared at the leather strap in his hand. "I spoke to him. You spoke for me. I was trying to protect you." Ruth climbed down carefully. Her face was calm, which was worse than anger. "From what?" Eli opened his mouth. She answered for him. "From choosing? No. From being foolish? No. From finding out I can still be hurt?" Eli looked away. Ruth rubbed the rope burn from her palm. "Your father did not spend 27 years teaching me to stand beside him so you could decide I am too fragile to stand beside anyone else." The words were not loud. They did not need to be. Eli set the harness buckle down. Outside, the bell shifted in the wind. It did not ring. Its rope was out of reach again. That night, Eli rode north. He found Jonah at the stage station under a lantern, fitting a new iron band around the wheel hub. Jonah saw him and set the hammer down. "Something wrong at the ranch?" "Yes." He reached for his coat. Eli stopped him with one word. "You." Jonah's hand fell. Eli stepped inside the lantern light. "I told you not to wake that house and leave. I heard you." "No, you heard the part that let you run." Jonah said nothing. Eli's breath smoked between them. "My mother tied the bell rope back up." The hammering from the far side of the station had stopped. Even the horses seemed to be listening. Jonah looked at the wheel hub, then at the road beyond Eli. "What do you want me to do?" Eli's expression hardened. "That is the wrong question. What is the right one?" "What do you want badly enough to stop pretending you're doing us a favor?" Jonah had crossed rivers in flood. He had slept through artillery. He had driven 6 tons of freight down mountain grades with one wheel smoking. None of that frightened him the way the answer did. "I want her." Eli's jaw tightened. Jonah held his gaze. "Not the ranch, not a roof, not a place to hang my coat." He swallowed once. Her Eli looked away toward the dark road. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its edge. "Then tell her. What if she says no? That would be her choice too." Eli mounted and turned his horse south. After 3 strides, he looked back. The north barn door came off in the wind. Jonah almost smiled. "Did it?" "No." Then Eli rode away. Jonah stood alone under the lantern. For the first time in years, he did not ask the road what came next. He already knew. Dawn found him at the Calder gate. Snow had begun to fall, light and dry, tracing the fence rails white. Ruth was on the porch with a bucket in one hand. She saw Jonah, stopped, then set the bucket down. He walked through the gate without tools. That was the first thing she noticed. No hinge in his pocket, no lumber on the mare, no excuse tied behind the saddle. He stopped at the bottom step. Ruth looked at his empty hands. "What broke?" "Nothing." "Then why are you here?" Jonah took off his hat. The snow caught in his dark hair and melted against his temples. "Because I left." Her face did not soften. "You did. I thought I was respecting you. You were deciding for me." "Yes." The answer came fast enough to surprise them both. Jonah stepped onto the first stair. "I have spent most of my life leaving before a place could ask anything of me." Ruth's eyes shone, but her voice stayed steady. "And what is this place asking?" He looked at the house, at the repaired window, at the pump, at the silent bell, then back at her. "Nothing." He took another step. "You are." A long breath moved through Ruth. She had carried grief, debt, winter, sick animals, broken fences, and every opinion the valley had about a widow living alone. But this was different. This asked her to put down the strength she knew and trust a strength she did not. "What do you think I'm asking?" she said. Jonah reached the porch. "For the truth. And?" He looked directly at her. "I love you," snow whispered against the roof. Ruth's mouth trembled once. "Not weakness. Recognition." "You love fixing things," she said. "I do. You love being needed sometimes. That is not the same as loving me." "No." Jonah moved no closer. "I love that you sharpen the kitchen knives better than I do." A tiny change touched her face. "I love that you pretend your coffee is not terrible." Another change. "I love that you speak to your horse more kindly than you speak to most men." Ruth's eyes lowered. "And I love that you did not ask me to save you from the road." He took one breath. "You only made me want to leave it." Ruth looked at him for a long time. Then she stepped forward, took his hat from his hand, and set it on the porch rail. "You don't get to call running away respect," she said. "No, Mom. You don't get to disappear when Eli looks at you hard." "No, Mom." You don't get to repair half my house and then act surprised when I notice the empty spaces. Jonah's voice dropped. No, Mom. Ruth placed one hand against his coat. Good. Then she kissed him. Not like a girl surrendering to a dream. Like a woman choosing something with her eyes open. When they stepped apart, Eli was at the gate. He sat in the saddle, snow gathering on his shoulders. Ruth looked at him. You followed him? I wanted to see if he brought tools. Jonah glanced toward his empty saddle. Eli nodded once. That helps. By spring, Jonah had moved his tool chest into the Calder barn. Not the house. Ruth made that boundary clear. He respected it. Mostly, they worked through thaw together. He repaired the irrigation gate while she pruned the orchard. She taught him which apple trees had survived the hard freeze of '82. He taught her how to reset a wagon tire without paying the blacksmith. They argued about where to store nails. They argued about whether coffee could be improved by boiling it less. They argued once, fiercely, over Jonah buying a second mare without asking. Then they laughed before either could win. The house changed by degrees. A second coat hung beside the kitchen door. 2 pairs of boots stood under the bench. A man's razor appeared beside Ruth's wash basin, then vanished when she told him it had not been invited. The brass bell remained silent. Jonah never touched it. One warm evening in May, Ruth climbed the same ladder herself. Jonah came around the barn carrying a coil of rope. He stopped. She untied the old knot. The bell rope dropped through her hands and swung free. Jonah did not move. Ruth climbed down. Pull it, she said. He looked at her. You sure? No. That was the truest answer she could have given. Jonah took the rope. The bell sounded across the orchard. Birds lifted from the apple trees. The mare raised her head. Eli, riding in from the north field, slowed but did not stop. Ruth laughed before the final echo faded. This time, she did not look surprised by the sound. In June, Jonah asked her to marry him. He did it beside the well with grease on one sleeve and a new pump gasket in his hand. Ruth said the proposal was badly timed. Jonah said timing had never been his strength. She told him to ask again after supper. He did. She said yes. They married in September beneath the brass bell. Mrs. Bell brought a cake that leaned to one side. The stage driver played fiddle. Eli stood beside Jonah with the grave expression of a man witnessing both a wedding and a transfer of responsibility. Before Ruth came out, Eli adjusted Jonah's collar. You leave, he said. I will find you. Jonah looked at him. I know. Eli held his gaze another second. Then his expression eased. No, he said. I think now you do. Ruth stepped onto the porch in a dark blue dress. Jonah forgot every word he had practiced. The preacher had to ask him twice whether he took her as his wife. Ruth smiled through the whole thing. After the vows, she reached for the bell rope. Jonah covered her hand with his. Together they pulled. The sound crossed the orchard, the barn, the well, and the south field. It reached the freight road where Jonah had once planned to keep going. Years later, travelers would hear that bell before they saw the Calder place. Some said it called workers in from the fields. Some said Ruth rang it whenever Jonah stayed too long in town. Eli told people the truth only when he trusted them. The bell had never been the thing that woke the house. It was only how the house let the valley know it was awake. Jonah did not rescue Ruth. Ruth did not rescue Jonah. They simply stopped mistaking silence for strength, and once they did, the whole house found its voice.